Hi, welcome to our Let's Go Trips and Travel 301 training. This is an online training. We want to thank you for taking the time to take our training today. My information is here on the screen in case you have any questions or follow-up suggestions or comments. And let me just start again by saying thank you for all that you do for Girl Scouts and in your volunteering role, as well as taking the time to take this online training at your convenience. So let me start by asking a question, and that question is, why are you taking this class? So most of you taking this class, if not everybody, is taking this class because it is required for any troop that's going on a trip. Our council, Girl Scouts of the Desert Southwest, has made this training a requirement for a troop to go on a trip. And it's quite simple, just like that. So a trip is defined as any outing or activity that occurs outside of your regular meeting place, whether that's an hour long or an overnight or even longer, as you'll hear some examples later on today. At the core of it, although the reason this class is required of any troop going on a trip is to help keep our troops safe and build confidence in our volunteers by acquiring all the knowledge that you'll need and you'll get today on going on a trip. So here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to keep it, I'm going to try and keep it as short and simple as possible. So our items will go over our progression. We'll go over some examples of types of trips and how we categorize those. And then we'll spend most of our time on talking about the process for traveling with your troop. And then lastly, we'll end with some key resources so you know where it is that we got all of this information and where you can also go and refer to it. The first topic on our list is progression. And progression is very simply asking the question, are we ready? Are the girls ready to go? Are the adult volunteers ready to take them? And how do you know that? So progression plays a really important part of Girl Scouting. It's defined as simply one activity that leads to the next. It's an important safeguard in Girl Scouts. It basically keeps all the girls, all us, volunteers, parents, and everybody involved safe. You can think of girl readiness when we think about progression in three ways. So how are the girls, do we know if they're emotionally ready to go on this trip, physically ready, and mentally ready? So I'll give you just one example of each. We could spend a lot of time on this. But for example, emotional readiness. Are the girls asking to go? Or do they come up to you at a meeting? Do they have an interest and express that interest in going on a trip? That's pretty clear indication they're emotionally ready to go. For physical readiness, it really depends on the type of trip that you're talking about, because going on a tour to an indoor museum is going to require a lot less physicality than maybe going on a hike at a mountain or a park near you. So it will really depend on the type of trip. But some examples of physical readiness are, do the girls have the stamina that they need for that trip? The energy. Can they carry their own stuff for the entire trip? Those are just some examples. There's a lot more. Mental readiness is really anything having to do with maturity. And so this will really depend on the level of the troop, of course. But some things that kind of follow in every category is the maturity to follow your safety guidelines that were presented to the girls to start a trip. Or maybe also the maturity to follow the buddy system that we use in Girl Scouts. So do they have the maturity to do those items? So keep in mind, while I gave you examples, that it is unrealistic to really expect that every one of our Girl Scouts will check off all of these conditions. That would be a perfect scenario. Instead, we want to ask if the areas that they are lacking should prohibit her from participating in the trip. For example, does she not follow the buddy system or refuses to? That could be a potentially dangerous situation. On the other hand, it could also be an opportunity on this trip to be around other girls who exhibit and follow that, and perhaps that will help her. So just a couple of things to keep in mind. When we talk about progression, they are baby steps. So I want to go over two simple examples. One is a brownie troop that has finished their first meeting. The girls had a great time, and they tell you, the leader, that they want to make their next meeting as a sleepover. So I often ask this question of leaders in new leader training. Usually the reaction I get is one of shock. And I tell them, listen to your gut instinct. It's telling you that for a reason. If you're not comfortable with this, then that's probably because you're not ready. And if you're not ready, I guarantee you the girls are not going to be ready for that sleepover. They may think they are, but in fact they are not. And you want to listen to that. And the reason you're not feeling ready is because we haven't followed the progressive steps to get there. So we tell the girls that's a great idea. Perhaps we can do that later on. But there's a lot of other steps that we got to do in our troop meetings before we can do the sleepover. Another example is this. A new Daisy troop has finished their first meeting. This time, it's not the girls that come up to you, but it's the parents. They come up to you after the meeting, and they insist that the troop go camping next month. So again, you'll probably have that same reaction. Camping is a whole other level. Listen to your gut. Let the parents know Girl Scouts, is all about camping. There'll be opportunities to do that in the future. However, in the meantime, there's things that we have to do and follow. For example, there's a camp training that has to be done by volunteers going on a camping trip ahead of time. So these are two really good examples so that when you're with your troop day in and day out, you keep the importance of our progression principle in mind. So in the Trailblazing Badge for cadets, there's what they call the Maturity Quotient Quiz. It does the same thing. It asks you to grade yourself on certain characters of maturity. So that's kind of fun to do also. So that's progression. I want to now move into some examples of types of trips. So I often get this question a lot. There's a lot of different types of trips that you could do with your Girl Scout troop, right? Pretty much anything you can do with your family, you can do in a Girl Scout troop and more. So just to give you a few examples, here are some. So we have parks, museums, amusement parks, libraries, fire stations, zoos. I mean, there's a lot more that could have been added, but here's just a few examples. Remember that any trip for the purposes of this training is an activity or an outing that occurs outside of your regular meeting place. So let's talk about the types of trips a little further. So I want to make this a little clearer because there's a lot of different types of trips. So I'd like for us to think of the types of trips as a spectrum. So on one side, you have basic day trips, which could vary in length. For example, you could choose to have a day trip that is instead of your troop meeting. Usually troop meetings are about an hour or two. So maybe instead of the meeting this time, we're going to go to the park nearby. So that would be an example. Or maybe you have a half day or a full day trip with your troop. So those are day trips. You also have overnight trips. And for this training for today, we're going to consider overnight trips of 1 to 2 nights in this category. Then you also could have extended overnight trips, which is now getting into 3 nights or more, and international trips. So kind of think of it as a spectrum. Keep in mind 2 things as we consider these possibilities. One is that it's very helpful to consider these in terms of indoor and outdoor. Whether your trip happens indoors or outdoors adds another factor that you want to plan around. For example, like I mentioned, a day trip to a local indoor museum is very different from a day trip to the zoo, especially during, summer or winter months. If we follow our principle of progression, it makes sense to have our first trips be indoors in these cases. Another thing to consider is also remember that these trips that we're talking about are not camping trips. Camping is a whole different category with its own process and planning. If your troop is planning a camping trip, it should not be your first trip. Again, we're talking progression, and it requires that you take our Let's Camp Outdoor Camping 401 training, which you can look at our calendar for future listings of near you. So lastly, looking at this image for today's training, for this online training, for paperwork purposes that we're going to discuss later, this training will focus on basic day trips and overnight trips. That's what we will focus on just these two. We'll refer to these two as basic trips. All right, so let's get into the process of travel. Here is a circle diagram with 6 steps. This is what we'll talk about for the rest of the training. This is where we get into the details and policies that you need to follow, as well as tips to help you and your troop plan a successful trip. There are 6 steps in all. We have planning, permission, travel, evaluate, celebrate, and share. I will say that most of our time will be spent on planning, number 1. After all, our Girl Scout motto is be prepared, right? It's we can't plan for everything, but the more and better we plan, the better quality of experience is had by everyone involved. So let's get started. The first is planning. And we want to make sure, when we talk about planning, that first it is girl-led. Girl-led is about making sure that whatever trip or outing the girls are involved. Daisies through ambassadors should and can be involved in the decisions of their troops, including trips. For example, if you have been working with a group of brownies who really likes animals, they can be given 3 choices for a trip based on that interest. For example, the zoo, veterinary clinic, or the Humane Society near you. Older Girl Scouts can be asked to provide options to vote on, or maybe even research options themselves. It is vital to have the girls involved in the planning because it is their troop. Girls at every level are able to make some decisions about the trip. It's up to us as the leaders to help them with that. So you want to practice group planning and basically ask ourselves, what can I do as a leader to assist the girls in their planning? Because the troop belongs to them. You can help them explore activities, help them make their plans and choices, encourage them to set, certain learning goals or fun goals, and actively listen to them. You can ask them questions, lots of questions to get them to vocalize. So, for example, what do they want to experience? What are we interested in going? How will we get there? How will we earn the money to get there? What can we do now to get ourselves ready? What safety issues do we have to consider? What will we do as we travel? And there's a lot of questions you could help ask the girls so that they can begin their planning, but those are some examples. The next part of the planning process is to make sure that your trip, whatever that is purposeful and clear. So what we mean by that is that all girls, volunteers, and parents associated with the trip should be clear on what the purpose is. It doesn't really matter if the trip is to earn a badge or learn a new skill, discover a culture, or just for fun. That's great. The point here is to make sure that as the leadership that we communicate that clearly to everyone involved so that when we are on that trip perhaps and somebody comes up and asks us, whether that's a girl or an adult, that we're able to express that and we're clear. There is something available that is recommended. This is not required, but there's something called a Girl and Adult Travel Participation Agreement. It's a form that we have available online, or you can make your own for your own troop, and it's a way to set clear expectations and guidelines for the trip. And on one side, there's one for girls and there's one for adults. And like I said, you can edit it as you would see fit for that trip. But it's a very good way to make sure everything's clear, everything's laid on the table, and they've signed off on it. So we have their buy-in. All right, so we're on the planning phase of our process for travel. We talked about making sure the trip is girl-led, making sure that it's purposeful and clear. The next big part of the planning phase is the adult requirements. So we'll spend some time on that. And the first thing is to make sure that our troop leaders have taken the required training, which is this one we're doing here, the 301. You need to have your troop leaders all take this. It is a requirement for the troop. You also should have at least one volunteer who has been certified in first aid and CPR, and that would be your first aider, what we call a first aider. You don't have to get the certification through our council, but we do offer them on occasion as a courtesy. They do have to be through an approved agency, such as the American Heart Association. The list of those approved agencies are in Volunteer Essentials, which I will refer back to later today. Feel free to look at our online calendar for any future listings of first aid and CPR trainings near you. So that's the first requirement, the training of our adults. And the next big requirement dealing with adults is the ratios. We want to make sure we have enough volunteers for the number of Girl Scouts that we are taking on the trip. We call this our adult to girls ratios. This is nothing new. You guys have been following this. However, this chart that you see here has different numbers because this chart is specifically for events, trips, outings, anything away from your troop meeting. For example, according to this chart, if I have a troop of 14 brownies, I will need 3 volunteers. And I want to take the time to also remind us that if we have different girls of different levels going on the trip, such as in a multi-level troop, that we will follow the ratio for the youngest level. For example, if I have a troop that has daisies, brownies, and juniors, I'm going to follow the daisy ratios for all of them. I also want to take a minute to remind us that there should always be a minimum of 2 volunteers with Girl Scouts at all times. So let's say you only have 5 Girl Scouts in your troop, only 3 of them show up for the trip, you still at all times need to have 2 volunteers. If you only have 2, they cannot be related, living in the same household, and one has to be a female. And that's according to our council volunteer policies. This is information that's mentioned in the new leader training. I just wanted to remind us all of that. And all adults working directly with the girls, handling money for the troop, driving or chaperoning the girls, must be a registered member of GSUSA, of Girl Scouts, and complete a background check. All right, so that's adult requirements. A couple more things with adult requirements, because when we talk about ratios, we always want to discuss tag-alongs. So what about tag-alongs? Well, it's quite simple. A tag-along is defined as any individual, whether that's child or adult, who's not a registered Girl Scout member. They potentially pose a liability because they're not covered under our Girl Scout accident activity insurance that all members are. So if your trip does have tag-alongs, that's great, that's fine. You will need to purchase additional insurance to cover them. And the way you do that, there's a form. This is an example of the form. It's online on our website, and you fill it out and turn that in with the other paperwork that you may need to turn in that we'll go over later. Remember that any adult volunteer with tag-alongs do not count towards your ratio. So what we mean by that is if you, according to the chart we saw earlier, if you need 3 volunteers, but one of those volunteers brings a tag-along, then they are going to be supervising the tag-along, right? That's their responsibility. And so that they they would need to be, somebody else would need to come and take their place as to fill in your ratios. So that's what we mean by that. And if that's not clear for any reason, feel free and reach out to me. So additional insurance is necessary for tag-alongs going on your trip. Lastly, I wanted to just ask ourselves, how many adults is too many for the trip? You can have a Girl Scout troop trip that includes family members, moms, dads, grandparents, siblings, or you could have trips that's only for girls and the volunteers necessary per your ratios. That's what I call a troop solo trip. So you think of it as a spectrum again, or linear. So you have your troop solo trips on one side where it's just the girls and the adults, volunteers that you need. And then on the other side you have your troop trips with all the tag-alongs that are invited. There is a time definitely for both types of trips for your troop. It's up to you as the leadership of the troop to figure out what's the best mix of both for your troop. It's important to make sure that if you are doing, though, a troop solo trip, that there's a purpose for each adult going. Each volunteer going should have something to do. All right. So that was adult requirements. Moving along in our planning phase, I wanted to talk about safety. Safety is, of course, something that we really focus on. We're dealing with girls. We work with girls. We volunteer with girls. So the very first thing you want to consider is your safety activity checkpoints. Safety activity checkpoints is a resource that GSUSA puts out, and it has activities in it that are alphabetically listed, things from archery to playgrounds to hiking and much, much more. So you want to follow these activity checkpoints for any activities that you may be doing on your troop trip. If there's something that's not listed, please contact your membership manager for more information. So while we're on this topic, I wanted to outline some really clear warnings and restrictions on activities that GSUSA has placed. All of this is in Volunteer Essentials again, but it's important enough for me to copy and put here. There are some activities that require pre-approval from us, from council, for girls ages 12 and older. And so you see that list here on your screen. Things such as operating motorized vehicles, go-karts, personal watercraft, so on and so forth. So those are approved, but you need to get written pre-approval from council first. There is another list of activities that are not approved for any girl, and that's anything that's uncontrolled, is free-falling activity, extreme variations of certain activities like high-altitude climbing. So I'll leave this up here for a bit so you can reference it. All right, so when we're talking about safety, the first thing you want to check is safety. Make sure that we're following safety activity checkpoints. So I'm going to move along the list for safety. You want to also make sure you have a first aider, which we already talked about. You want to have at least one of those going on your trip. You want to make sure that you have a first aid kit at all of your troop meetings, and especially on your trip. And if you're taking multiple vehicles, it's a good idea to have one in each car as well. You also want to make sure that each girl going on the trip has a health history record. You should have those on file anyways. That's required. It's required for every girl to have one completed. It is recommended that your adults going on the trip also have one on file. All this information is confidential, so it should be secured as such. Asking the adults to submit one is to their benefit in case something were to happen and we had to call emergency services. Number 5 is medications. All medication must be in original containers, and they have to be kept by the first aider. This includes medication for adults traveling with the group too, and this is for the safety of all the girls. Medication, including over-the-counter products, cannot be dispensed without prior written permission from a girl's custodial parent or guardian, which is why we have the health history record. Some girls may need to carry and administer their own medication, such as an inhaler or an EpiPen, if that is okay with their parents. Allergies is next. You want to make sure that we are aware of their allergies, and we're helping the girls to be self-aware of their allergies as well. That information is asked on the health history record. And then emergencies is number 7. So if an accident occurs, are we prepared to handle that, right? That's something we should always ask ourselves. As we all know, unfortunately, emergencies may and can happen. So make sure that you have a copy of our council's emergency procedures at all of your meetings and on your trips. Some even choose to fold it up and put it in their first aid kit. You want to have that. You also want to find out where your nearest emergency facility is if you're somewhere that you're not familiar with. If you have to get up in the middle of the night and for whatever reason go to the emergency center, then you want to have an idea where that is. So this is our safety planning. We also want to talk about teaching girls safety. So we cannot talk about safety without also the importance of teaching safety to the girls as well. Daisies through ambassadors can learn about safety and well-being when they earn the safety award. Brownies through ambassadors can earn the first aid legacy badge, and all of these are in the Girls Guide to Girl Scouting by each grade level. But here are some examples of things that you want to go over with your girls. So teach them what to do if they're confronted by strangers. Make sure you have an agreed upon signal to use if they're uncomfortable. Teach them how to react when confronted by a stranger who's bothering them. You want to teach girls what to do if they become separated from the group. Identify safe sources of help, who and who not to ask for help. Buddy system is a really big one, right? Make sure they know and are using the buddy system. You also want to teach the girls how to stay safe during the trip, what to do if she loses something like money or her luggage, how to report a crime if that applies, what to do if you need emergency help, how to deal with a large crowd. Those are just some of the ideas that you could incorporate as you're teaching girls about safety for the trip. So moving along in our planning phase of our process is transportation. For example, there are 3 ways that you could get to your trip as a troop. You could do where parents each transport their daughter, their Girl Scout. They drop them off and pick them up. You could do number 2, where you carpool together to that trip and back in a few vehicles. Or number 3, where you make the use of rental vehicles or leasing vehicles, right? So during your first few trips as a troop, it is much easier to use option number 1, where each troop drops off and picks up their Girl Scout. Again, if we're starting with trips, this follows our progression principle. If you will be going on a trip as either a carpool or rental vehicles, you want to make sure and follow a couple of guidelines. You have to, of course, make sure each driver is an approved adult volunteer. They have a good driving record, a valid license, and a registered insured vehicle. You want to make sure girls don't drive other girls, right? When we're talking about, girls 16 and older who are starting to get their permit and licenses, they are not allowed to drive other girls. Make sure everyone's in a legal seat with their seat belts, adhering to the state laws regarding booster seats and anything like that. Another point for planning your trip may be lodging. So you may be spending the night. So a couple of things to mention with that is if there are men volunteers or men going on your trip, you want to make sure and have separate sleeping quarters for them and a separate restroom for them. And then the other item is when it comes to sharing beds. So GSUSA requires that we get permission from parents if girls are going to be sharing a bed. So we're talking about, when maybe we're spending the night at a hotel or a cabin with beds or things like that. If the girls are going to be sharing a bed, we want to get permission from parents beforehand. All right, and a couple of places where you could be spending the night would be program centers, hotels, cabins. They'll even have overnight activities at certain museums and zoos and aquariums, so things like that. All right, so that's our planning phase. Believe it or not, that is the largest chunk of our process because there's so much to cover. I want to do a quick review before we move on to the rest of the process, which will be a lot briefer. So just to reiterate, in the planning phase, we want to make sure that everything is girl-led, make sure our troop is purposeful and clearly communicated. When it comes to adult requirements, we want to make sure we have the training we need, we're following the ratios, and if we have tag-alongs that we're purchasing additional insurance. We talked about safety planning and how to involve the girls in the safety planning. And then we talked about a couple of items when it comes to transportation, some of the options that you have, and when it comes to lodging, some things to remember. All right, our next step of our process for travel is permissions. So that's number 2. We're going to get into some more of the details and paperwork. It's required that you, for any troop trip that is overnight or outside of our council area, that you get a council permission approved. So let me be extremely clear on this. So this is an online training. This is Let's Go Trips and Travel 301. It is required of all troops going on any trip. And we keep track of that by having you log in to take this training today. We have a list of that. The basic trip permission form we are discussing here and that you see on your screen is to acquire council permission for your trip if only your trip is outside of our council or an overnight trip. Keep in mind that this does not apply for any trip or to a service unit event or a council-sponsored event. So for example, if your local service unit has every year they put together an event like a lock-in or a rally or a father-daughter or a mother-daughter, then your troop registers, your girls register for those through the service unit. We don't need for you to do any more paperwork for council purposes. Same goes for council events. So if we do an overnight at a baseball stadium that council puts on, we are registering for that event with us. We don't need your troop to do any additional paperwork for that to get approval. I hope that's a little clear. If not, feel free to reach out to me. So in order to get council permission, you must submit the basic trip permission form that you see here to your membership manager at least 3 weeks before your trip. Your membership manager will review and approve it or be in contact with you for more details or questions. That's permission step 1. The next thing when it comes to permission is getting permission from parents of girls going on the trip. For all trips, whether they're service unit, council, or troop solo trips, and regardless of whether it's a day trip or an overnight trip, you will need to get parent permission for the girls. This is a simple form that you have the parents fill out. So you see an example of it here. It's on our website. And please keep this form for your records. We don't need it to be turned in. We don't keep those at council. This is for you as a leader of the troop to hold on to. All right, moving along, the next step, step number 3, is traveling. So we've done all the hard work of planning. We've gotten the permissions that we need to make memories with our Girl Scouts on their trip. You have been involving the girls in the planning of the trip, so they have been engaged. Now is a good time to go over some packing tips with the girls. So things like packing light, leaving their valuables at home, labeling their luggage. You can even take some time in your troop meetings before the trip to practice how to pack for a trip. It's also helpful during this time to prepare for Plan B, and Plan B stands for backup. As much as possible, at least. There's often things that happen that may alter our plans that we have no control over, like the weather or car problems or somebody gets sick or injured. unfortunately. So what are we going to do if those things happen? Do we have a contingency plan? Do we have a backup? So just a couple of questions to ask you, but definitely the travel section, this part of the process, where the girls are going on a trip and they're making memories. Step 4 of the process for travel is evaluate. It's important to do so. Evaluating gives girls the time and the space they need to absorb the experiences they're having, to make those connections, to reflect on what they have done. It can be done during or after the trip or both. There's many ways that you can evaluate the trip with your Girl Scouts. Here's a couple of examples. You can do an informal, casual series of questions like the ones you have on your screen there, asking the girls, what was the best part of your trip and why? Is there something that you would like to do, have been done better? Or what was your least favorite part, right? So those are some examples. Would you do it again? I think that's probably the telling question. Would you do this trip again if you could? And then get them to elaborate on each one of those questions, right? Why? You could do this verbally, or you could also do a more official way of evaluating with surveys that they have to fill out and turn in. I know a lot of older girls that like to do that, so it's up to you as a troop to figure out what works best for you, but that's evaluate. Step number 5 is celebrate. It's very simple. Celebrate means that we celebrate our successes along the way, from planning to going on the trip. It's important to do this along the way of reaching our goal of going on the trip because it enhances the experience that the girls have. Celebrating even the littlest accomplishment as well as the end result, right? The end result being the trip. So this is a good time that we could establish milestones for our trip as goals and then use those to track our progress and celebrate. So for example, we could have a list of items that have to be done in order for us to go on the trip. The girls are involved in that. One of those items could be, did we get the permission slips turned in on time by the parents? If we did, yay, great, time to celebrate that. Did girls who did not participate last year get to go this year? Did the troop reach its money earning goal? All of these are successes that we can be proud of when they are reached, and we could celebrate. And when we say celebrate, that doesn't mean it has to be elaborate or expensive. For example, we can give, Hershey kisses on hand and give each girl a Hershey's kiss when she turns in the permission slip. We could give them, free time, a happy dance, cupcakes, sing a song, anything to celebrate that milestone that's been reached. And this step helps us remember that it's not all about the trip, the destination, that there is a lot to be learned and gained from the journey as well. The last step of our process is share. Number 6, this is where we can turn our trip into a leadership experience by encouraging the girls to share what they have learned with others. So it follows our discover, connect, and take action model, right? Where the take action part is passing it forward. The same thing goes for sharing. The girls have gone on a trip, they had fun, they learned a lot. If they share that with others, then it turns this trip into a leadership experience as well. Here are a couple ideas for sharing. Popular is a scrapbook, so you can have girls bring pictures at the next troop meeting after your trip, and you can put together a scrapbook. Older girls like to do a lot of video montages with some background music, and that's a great way of capturing and sharing. You could have them put that information on a poster board and then go to a sister troop or another troop and share their experiences with them, saying if they would recommend that or not. The older girls, you could have them write articles pretending that they're a critic, a travel critic, and they are grading that trip and recommending it or not. You could have the girls put together a presentation to give at any event, school function or service unit event. Thank you letters is also another good way where they can formulate and write thank you letters to send to people that they met along the way during their trip. Maybe a park ranger or a tour guide, anything like that. So that is a process for travel. That's all of it from 1 through 6. So let me review really quickly here. This is planning phase, we went over all of these, making sure it's girl-led, purposeful and clear, adult requirements. We went over safety, transportation, and lodging. When it comes to permission, we talked about the forms that you need to turn in. Remember that you only need the basic trip applications submitted for trips that are overnight, up to 2 nights, or outside of our council. You must also receive permission from all parents, and if you have your troop has non-registered members or tag-alongs, then you have to purchase the additional insurance for them as well. Step 3 is all about the travel, making sure we're packing well and we're planning for for emergencies or contingency plan. Number 4 is evaluate. It's important. It helps girls make sense of everything, and we do that with a lot of questions that we ask them. Celebrating, setting up milestones, keeping the girls engaged in the entire process of the trip. Remember, it's not just about the destination, but the journey as well. And then lastly is sharing, where it turns your troop trip into a true leadership experience. So to review the paperwork that we've gone over today, after this training, you are set to begin your troop day trips or overnight trips of up to 2 nights. You're good to go. Here's a look at the paperwork steps that you will have to follow from now. During your planning, make sure that you have your emergency procedures document, which you should have at all your meetings anyways, and then make sure you have updated health history records for all the girls going on the trip. Required for girls, recommended for volunteers. When it comes to permission paperwork, you're going to need to submit the basic trip application and receive approval for that from your membership manager. You'll also have to have your parents sign the parent permission form allowing the girls to go on the trip. And then lastly, remember that if your trip involves tag-alongs, you also have to purchase additional insurance for them. Here are the key resources that I mentioned earlier that are available online and were used in putting the presentation or this training together. That is our Volunteer Essentials Handbook, which comes from GSUSA with some additions at the council level. Safety Activity Checkpoints, which comes straight from GSUSA. And then we have our Volunteer Policy Manual, which is council specific. All of these resources are available on our website for you to reference at any time if you'd like more detail or information. They are updated regularly. So for example, Volunteer Essentials and Safety Activity Checkpoints gets updated every year. And I say that so that you keep that in mind when you're deciding to print them out or not, because they are pretty long. Volunteer Policy Manual or Volunteer Policy Procedures gets updated not annually, but every couple years or so. So just keep that in mind. And with that, I will end the training for the Let's Go Trips and Travel 301 online training. Thank you again very much for everything that you do and for your taking your girls on trips and making memories. Make sure you have happy and safe travels. Thank you.